Welcome everyone to our panel discussion. First, I'd like to let you all know that the rescreening times for The Day Shall Come and In the Shadow of 9/11 will happen on Wednesday, October 20th at 12 p.m. and 2 p.m. Eastern Time, respectively. Those times can also be found on the festival website. And videos of the panels will live on the film discussions page of the festival website. We're very glad to be joined by 4 guests today. We have Narcassia Batiste, daughter of Narseal Batiste, the defendant in the Liberty City case and featured in the Shadow of 9/11. And we have Dan Reed, the director of In the Shadow of 9/11. He's made many films in addition to this one, probably most prominently Leaving Neverland, about the accusers of Michael Jackson. And we have Trevor Aaronson, a journalist with The Intercept and author of The Terror Factory. He's studied these sting cases a lot. Finally, we have Chris Morris, a director, comedian, and actor. He directed The Day Shall Come and Four Lions, which is also really funny and being shown at this festival on Sunday, October 24th at 1:30. I'd like to start with you, Chris, and I'm so glad you were able to join us. I thought you
So
were
am I.
incommunicado on an island hiding from the world, which sounded great to me, but we wanted you here, and somehow you're here, which is awesome. We met over 10 years ago, I think, when you were doing research for what became The Day Shall Come. You were super thorough and traveled around and met lots of the defendants, family members, lawyers, and advocates in these really unfair cases. And I want to thank you for that, for making this film, and for coming to our family conference and virtually at about 3 in the morning your time. Um,
That was something. Yeah.
yeah, and also I want to thank you for making us laugh, which is so important in the midst of all this darkness and terror and pain. But can you talk a little bit about how you got involved in this project and what you learned along the way?
Sure. It was strange because it hit me in Britain because actually the Liberty City 7 case was a big news splash on Rolling News, and I just happened to catch it in the corner of a pub I was in, and it was reported, as Dan's documentary has just shown, as a huge event. And there were aerial pictures, and there were kind of people in hazmats going into different buildings, and it looked enormous. And that full-scale ground war was part of the kind of early revelation of that plot. And it stuck in my head because I just thought, what the hell's happening to the world? You know, there's kind of like seems to be attacks arising left, right, and center. And I bumped into someone involved in the case a couple of years later in Washington, and he said, you know, that case, it was basically 7 bankrupt builders who wanted to ride into Chicago on horses. And I was like, what? This was supposed to be the biggest attack since 9/11. And that just piqued my curiosity. And the fellow that I met was an advisor in the case and was someone I knew was well informed on terrorism and what did and didn't constitute a terrorist. So I just embarked when I could, because I was working in the States at the time. I just went and met a range of people, and you know, I went to Portland. I visited you, Kathy, in Albany. I went to Orange County and met the guy who infiltrated the mosque there until he was thrown out for being too radical. I mean, he was an informant that basically got himself thrown out. Trevor knows all this stuff. And in fact, I met Trevor too. And so I met a lot of interesting people and a lot of people who were in trouble and pain, you know, because basically I met the family members of people who had been put in jail with these contrived stings, which all had the same mechanism which Dan's documentary and others like the Newborough Sting have shown. And it is, you know, it's ridiculous. I mean, there are ridiculous elements. It doesn't need me to say it, but it struck me as ridiculous. And particularly when you've got something as contrived as 6 Haitian Catholics going to jail as members of Al-Qaeda. But I knew, you know, the more I looked into it, the more I felt the twist was going to have a, you know, there was going to be pain involved, because if you're looking at the protagonists in those situations who are being manipulated by the government, then it doesn't end well. So it's a kind of comic, it's a tragicomic situation. But everything that people said to me, and I spoke to Mike German, I spoke to someone at the DOJ, and I said, look, you have a 99% conviction rate in these cases. That's insane. And he looked at me and he said, you know, Chris, really, it should be 100%. because we try all the cases with the best defense that anyone could offer, and we do all of that before we've even arrested somebody. So it's bound to go through. And I was just thinking, this is a game. And the odds of the big forces of the government against the little person, the individual, the defenseless individual, just seemed nuts to me. So I was kind of hooked, and I followed it through and made the film that you saw earlier.
Yeah, I think they get almost 100% conviction rate because there's not really any entrapment defense anymore, the way the law works. Did you know, I mean, were you surprised at how the law works here, that they're able to do these stings? Did you know that they were doing it beforehand, or because I
No,
don't
but I had a folk memory. You sort of see films in which stings happen, but the idea of a sort of preemptive sting, a kind of primitive, shaky kind of precog idea, no, I didn't realize. And obviously entrapment, there are cases in Britain where the law has infiltrated a group, an environmental protest group or something, and that has been revealed during a trial that one of the key activists was in fact a policeman, and the trial falls to pieces. So I was struck by how robust this mechanism is in relation to any kind of defense you may offer. And entrapment would seem to be the obvious one, until everybody, like you just said, Kathy, until everyone just said, I mean, that was the thing that struck me, was that the defense lawyers that I met said, look, in the end, the way these cases work, my job is really just to think about the plea bargain. We're probably going to plead guilty because there's no point in even trying to play an entrapment defense. No matter how manipulated the arrested person was, it's not going to work. And I mean, that is surprising. Yeah.
Yeah, it's surprising to me still after all these years. I mean, because it started out with the sting operations where there was, a group already committing crime, like drug crime, and they would be infiltrated by an informant. But they've been using it against people that are not in any kind of group, just manipulating them. And then if they offer them all sorts of money, manipulate them, and then the person starts saying what they think the informant wants to hear, that counts as predisposition, that they were predisposed to already commit the crime, even if they're just trying to con them, like in this case. All right, well, one more question for you right now, Chris, and then we'll probably come back to you later. But why did you decide to make a fictionalized movie rather than a documentary?
Well, I thought that it would be a way of incorporating more elements than you could in any one sting. The Newburgh sting has characteristics. The Albany case, with the guy being given a sort of a loan in the presence of somebody who's got a rocket, or he hasn't got a rocket, but he says he has, but he uses a code word called Chowdhury that the guy who's being set up doesn't understand. There are all sorts of different bits that I wanted to kind of reflect and also push the point, which sort of, I believe, nearly happened in Texas. There was that strange thing when those guys attacked that sort of provocative Draw the Prophet Muhammad cartoon event, and two guys who were being followed by an FBI agent basically went on a shooting rampage. They were both shot. But that triggered, I mean, it feels to me dangerous if you're going to go around encouraging people to get involved in dangerous ideas. What happens if somebody goes rogue on you? That you've wound them up and you've got them, essentially the government has radicalized someone vulnerable, and then they disappear, like that guy Zazi did, he was actually planning a plot, but he disappeared. They were tracking him, the law were tracking him, and when he disappeared, everybody panicked. Now, what if somebody is being wound up and they go off and they've got a dangerous weapon? They've managed to get one from a friend or something. Suddenly you, the law, have created a dangerous person. I wanted to include that in a storyline as well, so that you could escalate it and look at another side of the nonsense of what's going on. So, it was a number of reasons. And also I think the freedom to do it just frees you from the facts, which means that you can push things and I hope, sort of push the absurdity to the point where it is producing a laugh, albeit a painful laugh because you know people are going into a trap.
All right. Yeah, I really enjoyed the movie, and it was really funny. All right. I was going to talk to Narcassia, but we seem to have lost her. Hopefully, she'll be back. So I'll turn to you, Dan. Oh wait, she's coming back. Narcassia, hi.
Hello.
Okay. So, Narcassia, you're the daughter of Narseal Batiste, a key figure in the case and the documentary. And I'm really sorry for what you and your family went through with all of this. Can you talk about what it was like for you when he was first arrested, how old you were, and what it was like, and then going through 3 trials, I guess it was, and how long all that took and what that was like first?
All right, awesome. I'm inside of a building. I just want to make sure you guys can hear me okay. Am
Yeah,
I good? All right,
I think
wonderful.
so. Yep.
All right, awesome. My name is Narcassia Batiste. I am Narseal Batiste's daughter. At the age of the event, June 22nd, 2006, I was 11 years old. And where to begin? I was sitting inside of, the family van on a job site when a helicopter flew over me, and I just seen a bunch of black vehicles, and I didn't know if I was on a scene of a movie or what was going on. Maybe it was a surprise happening. I'm a little girl. I really couldn't put it all together. And then when I saw machine guns being pointed at me, and my younger brother and my mom, who was literally sitting across the ways on a table, while at the job site where my father and 2 of the brothers were pressure washing a home. I couldn't put it together of what was going on. And, being screamed at, get on the ground or I'm going to blow your head off. I became very furious. And I see them, federal agents are taking my father and putting him into a black vehicle. To me, that's kidnapping, because I had no idea what was going on. And I mean, through the whole trials that we had to go through, it was just pitiful. I mean, what I saw as, a young adult, of wanting to really just understand, and, the image that was portrayed of who my father was. But that's never who I knew my father to be. And that's
Yeah,
not him.
can you talk about that? What he is like
Of
and how it
course.
was different than how
He's,
he was portrayed in the case?
of course, he's a man. He's an honest man. He holds integrity. We follow principles of discipline, honesty, truth, freedom, and justice. And for the media to portray him to be other than that, it's really appalling. And the emotions that my family have felt was despair and the beginning of everything, and hopeless, because now we're viewed in the image that the media has portrayed, and no one, and I mean no one, reached out while we were homeless.
Wow. You were
I was
homeless?
11. I was homeless. We were homeless for about 2 years, living inside of that van
Wow.
with no food in parking lots of Walmart. I remember changing my clothes to go to school in the back of the van, and taking showers and baths in public park restrooms with my brothers.
That sounds horrendous. I'm so sorry. Um, and the arrest sounds horrible with the helicopter, machine guns, and they knew that was completely unnecessary. And they knew you were there,
Unnecessary.
and they just didn't care about terrorizing kids. It's just
No, and leave me traumatized and my brother traumatized, where we all suffer, a sort of paranoia.
yeah,
I mean, who wouldn't? You know what I mean? And
sure.
trust issues. And it's a long-term effect of what you have to do for within yourself, and your self meditation, to get yourself aligned and to really begin to heal. And that transition for me looked like where I am today. I'm an all-state agent, a mother of two handsome toddlers, and I'm finishing my bachelor's degree in psychology. Okay, I'm winning big in my company, Secret. I'm a VIP in the event, and the rest of my family, we're doing amazing. We're growing an amazing construction company, Exotic Venetian Plaster Masters LLC, and we we cannot, our faith cannot be shaken because of what they wanted to put on us and make us to be viewed as. It's our character that we believe within ourselves, and we walk into our purpose and we believe in our mission. And I'm here to live the legacy for my father. Thank you. My name is Narcassia, and I'm done.
Okay. Well, I wanted to talk to you a little bit more, but congratulations. So glad that you're doing so well after everything you've been through. That's amazing. Can you talk a little bit about going back to when he was in prison? Because he was in prison for a long time, or I guess it was about a 14-year sentence. Did you visit him a lot? What was it like? Did you have to travel to visit him? Or?
In the beginning, they did not allow us to visit him. They made a lot of excuses, stating that he did not want us to see him. And I later found out from him that that was not the truth. They were holding him against his will. They were not feeding him. He was medically suffering, as he has a parasite that lives within his stomach, and they did not care for him when he mentioned to the medical department within the prison that he's been dealing with these illness. They did not seek any sort of treatment for him, and to this day he still suffers from that. But no, they after he left the federal prison in downtown Miami, they shipped him to Virginia, and there we didn't have the funds at all to visit him. And so most of our communication was through letters that we would receive from him. My father's always been the host of the life of the party. You always come to him, and I just remember getting straight A's on my report card, and he's like, all right, let's go to Krispy Kreme donuts, and let's go to Toys R Us, and it's just missing that smile, missing that energetic being, and him just going through the torture that he was experiencing in there. Constant interrogations, constant blame and judgment for something that ultimately he was set up for.
Yeah. So your dad was released about 4 years ago, I think, to a halfway house, and then out from there when he finally finished his sentence. Can you describe what it was like reconnecting with him after all those years, and also how he's doing today?
Yes, absolutely. I still have yet to physically see him, but I do plan to. But yes, our communications through the phone and through video calls. I mean, it's always a blessing. Has in good spirits, a smile on his face, and he's working hard. Just to prove his character as he's a hardworking man. He's always been that, and the reconnection is priceless. And I know when I do see him coming in April to join us as we build our company here in South Florida. Well, in South Florida, I'm in Las Vegas now. It's going to be amazing for me, and overwhelming of joy. And I can't wait for that day.
Well, that's great. You're going to see him in April, and I guess he moved to what, Texas or
He's now located in Chicago.
Chicago? Okay.
Yes, Illinois. But he will be moving to Florida April of 2022.
Okay, great. All right, thank you, Narcassia. I'd like to turn to Dan and ask you, how did you get involved in making this film, and why did you want to do it?
It was Chris's fault, and he launched me on a path that took like 6 years and cost me a huge amount of effort and money, and I got very sick, and both Trevor and I got very sick actually.
Yeah.
From going to Haiti. But it was obviously all worthwhile. I think you know, I was really determined to tell the story of these guys. Actually, not just Narseal, but you know, the other 4 guys who also went to prison, who I felt for. I mean, this was clearly it was a tragedy for these families, because out of the blue they found themselves in this federal conspiracy case, and you know, arrested and in court charged with something that was really very far from their everyday existence. You know, that they one minute they were doing some drywalling and stucco work, and the next minute they were in front of a federal jury. So so I have a lot of sympathy, you know, for these guys, and they're all, you know, they were very young at the time, but that, you know, they're now obviously they've all come out of prison, and they reflect on their experience very intelligently, and they're a pleasure to, you know, to get to know. So and Narseal was great, you know, after you know, you said Narcassia, you know, they had trust issues, the guys, but I think we overcame those, and Narseal was kind enough to let me interview him for 3 days, you know, so we kind of tormented him for 3 days, got him to tell his story. You know, I think sort of stepping back from the tragedy of what happened to the families and the way it smashed up these really completely innocent families, is to look at the setting of 9/11 and how unprepared the FBI was to fulfill its new mission, which was to become a domestic counterintelligence agency, which it hadn't been before, right? And I think, you know, instead of splitting the FBI into 2 and creating a sort of MI5, that's the British domestic counterintelligence agency, and you know, in a separate criminal investigation agency, they decided to retain those 2 functions together. And I think, you know, I mean, the poor design of institutions in the wake of a crisis it's kind of a boring thing to raise, you know, because we have Narcassia here, who's very, you know, personally affected by this, and it's like, well, what the hell has my story got to do with, you know, the way the FBI was restructured after 9/11? But you know, that's one of the things I've tried to show in the film, is the way these institutional changes and the way a lack of preparedness and a sort of a vacuum in the FBI's capacity translates into, you know, on the ground, a lot of crazy stuff. And you know, what I tried to do in the film was to try and understand how it looked, not just from the perspective of Narseal and his friends and colleagues, but also from the FBI perspective, because I thought that was important to understanding why these things happen. You know, we know it's wrong, but do we understand why it happens? And so that was kind of my mission, and it took an awful long time, because I, for a long time, didn't really understand. And you know, Trevor was amazing, because he's put together numbers, and he's really, you know, studied these cases, not just going back to, you know, the early years of the war on terror, but, you know, right up to today. So he helped me a lot, and he also helped me shoot second camera, even when he was very ill with salmonella. So yeah, we both got really sick. We both got really sick in Haiti, and in fact, some of the interviews in Haiti, I remember we were interviewing a lovely guy called Ligleson Lemorin Levi, and he lived in a tiny shack. You know, he'd been thrown out of America, deported to Haiti, even though he was acquitted of all charges, and that seemed to me particularly unfair. That he was married to an American woman, and so his life was, he spent 3 years, I think, in immigration detention, and then was expelled. And so we caught up. Trevor and I caught up with him in really what I can only describe as a small shack by the road, on the outskirts of Port-au-Prince, the Haitian capital, and we did the interviews there, and interviewed him over a couple of days. But by that time, Trevor got quite sick, and so he was lying on Levi's bed, having, you know, valiantly tried to continue pulling second camera for me. So yeah, it was a mission. It was an odyssey. But what I hope we can begin to understand is the kind of panic that overcame America in the wake of 9/11, and this was entirely justifiable panic because it's still, we've recently had the anniversary, and it's still like an incredible shock to see those towers get hit like that. And in the wake of that panic, like, I think we underestimate how completely unprepared and lacking in capacity and lacking in resources, in human resources. There was a lot of money, but they didn't have investigative techniques, and they made all sorts of assumptions. The FBI, they assumed there were a lot of plots out there. They assumed, and so what ended up happening through the Liberty City case and other cases is that, I think instead of reassuring the American public that, well, in fact, maybe this was kind of a big one-off thing, and instead, by effectively manufacturing a lot of these terrorism cases, I think that helps to spread fear, because if a terrorist goal is to spread fear, because that's the whole point of terrorism, right? It's a psychological operation. It's not really the violence is kind of secondary. You use the violence to spread fear, and if the US government is creating these cases which suggest to the public that there's a lot more terrorists out there than actually there are, because Narseal Batiste, we all agree, and to the senior levels of the DOJ, to the senior levels of the FBI, we all agree Narseal and his colleagues were not terrorists, right? They were not terrorists. But if you tell the American public by putting these people on trial 3 times that there's a whole ton of terrorists out there, and these terrorists have come from, your African American communities and your Haitian American communities, and oh my God, they're lurking in our midst, the enemy within is there, then I think that just amplifies the terrorists' reach and plays to their goals, which is to scare the living daylights out of ordinary Americans who don't know what the hell's going on. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Did you want to say something, Chris? Or?
Well, I mean, that's brilliant, what Dan's just said. And it's reflected in Mike German's book, which is a good one to read on a plane, called Thinking Like a Terrorist. You sit there drawing looks from all directions. But in that book, he's very clear about what Dan just said, which is that the one thing you mustn't do is fall into the trap that is set by this, what you would call an asymmetric sort of warfare. And in other words, keep your head, deal with it as a legal issue. You can't go around doing that, but don't start getting into a fatigue about ideology, because as you saw with the Liberty City 7, I mean, so, the Moorish Science Temple is nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, but ignorance in the system managed to somehow join together 2 completely unrelated ideologies. And by using, so bad intel at every stage, color of skin is an indicator of suspicion, and a religious ideology that we don't understand must be something to fear. You build a bureaucratic machine that seems to just sort of fly overhead, randomly zapping the lives of people who have no way of fighting back. And also, there doesn't seem to be the interest really in stopping it. I mean, that was another thing that really shocked me, was going around talking to people involved in the Portland case, in the all sorts of different cases, the Newberg case and others. The efforts to bring about justice are really down to a very small number of people, which is why it's correct to credit Trevor with the amazing work he's done logging all of this, because then other media organs can come and feed off that. But still, the appetite actually to do anything about this is really low. I think I'm right in saying that.
It is, unfortunately, yeah. And to me, it makes you wonder who are the terrorists, who are the ones that are spreading terror, because it seems like it's the government. And back to Dan, you as you talked about, you gave the FBI and the prosecution a lot of time in the movie to try to justify what they did. But it does come across really clearly that Narseal was just trying to con this informant out of money. They weren't even Muslim, as has been said, and they clearly had no interest in violent jihad. just like the Newburgh 4 case. They just needed the money, and he was trying to con it out of somebody who apparently had a lot of it and was willing to give it to him. Do you think, this is my question, and I don't know, and maybe it's a little of both. Do you think the FBI agents, at least at some point, knew this, that he was no threat, that they were no threat, or were they just really paranoid and thought that they were somehow a threat?
I'm certain that they knew he was no threat, and and 100% by the third trial, they're all, the 3 out of the 5 remaining defendants, or 6 remaining defendants were 4 out of the 4 out of the 6 remaining defendants were released on bail, except for Narseal and Patrick Abraham, who were considered more dangerous. And I think everyone knew these weren't actually terrorists. But I think there were, as to Chris's point, it's like, well, there are some really bad guys out there, and this really bad thing happened to us. And if anyone's sort of, if the sort of magic dust of suspicion settles on anyone at all, just get them out the way, get them off the street, get them out of here, and it doesn't matter. And often the people like the Liberty City 7 who are caught up in these operations are not, they're not very strongly represented in politics or society. They're people who are at the margins, and I think it may sound brutal, but I think most Americans would rather just, for the avoidance of doubt, just in case, get them off the scene, and and we all feel a bit safer. And that's a terrible thing, and it actually cumulatively becomes, I think a real problem. And it's also, if you just look at it from the point of view of the effective prosecution of a counterterrorism policy, it's really bad. It's this isn't what you should be doing with your counterterrorism dollars. And it's, there are some real bad guys out there, and they're not all on the Islamist side, right? By the way, of course, there are people who want to commit political violence right across the spectrum, and we've just seen, we've got this January 6th documentary coming out on HBO on Wednesday. And that the attack on an assault, a physical assault, involving people armed with baseball bats, knives, guns, all sorts of things, on the heart of American democracy. How did the FBI miss that? Where
Well, Chris, did you want to add?
Sorry, do you mind me doing this? I mean, you don't have to pay
No,
attention.
It's okay, but I'm going to get to Trevor pretty soon. I want.
Good. Yeah. So I'm not trying to steal Trevor's ground, obviously, but it does just what Dan said reminds me of a security analyst that I met during the research, who in 2009 had published a report that demonstrated that by far the biggest threat to America was from right-wing groups, not from Muslim terrorists. And he was so shredded by Fox News that the government actually dropped him. They retracted the report, and he lost his job. But that was a brave guy who, by the way, was a Republican and sort of conservative-minded person, but saw what he saw and reported it, and got absolutely monstered for daring to suggest that the biggest threat in America was from the right. I
do remember that during the Obama administration.
Yeah.
Okay, Dan, your film just came out pretty recently. What would you say its impact has been so far? I know there's been some articles and discussion of it.
Yeah, I think among people who are interested in the more kind of obscure flavor of current affairs, it's been noticed, and people have said kind things about it. It's such, and this was the challenge of making it, and the reason why it took so long is it's such a complex story. It's genuinely, every story is complex, but it is really like uber complex, and there has all these nuances, and because it's this crazy story where some guys tried to scam someone out of some money who turned out to be an informant, and it took a long time to put it all to get the elements and put it all together, and I think it remains, an obscure piece of documentary cinema. I think we put everything we had into it, and we really tried to make it into cool film to watch, an engaging film to watch. It is terribly long as well because you just can't tell the story much quicker. But I feel, I'm thrilled that Frontline took it because I think that gives it a platform to people who have an interest in that kind of serious sort of journalism about grey areas and the sort of hidden corners of the political landscape. But it hasn't had the impact of some of my other films, and that's fine because I'm extremely proud to have done it and very grateful to Chris and Trevor for having helped me along the way and illuminated the path. But yeah, it's been a labor of love, and it's been an important film for me to make. But I do feel, as Chris says, there's an awful lot of people who just don't care that this is going on. And
yeah. Well, I'm really grateful to both of you for making both of these films, and I hope they get more of an audience somehow at some point, and that people start to rethink this stuff. And that's why we're doing this film festival. So hopefully that'll help a little bit. All right, I want to turn to Trevor. Trevor, you've been studying these cases for a long time. Can you talk a little bit, and it's been mentioned a little bit, but how these cases work and why the FBI loves this model so much?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. And I should note, it's, Dan and Chris know the story. The Liberty City 7 case in particular for me is important because that's the case that got me interested in this subject. I was actually a reporter in Miami, not covering national security at the time. And there was the announcement of this arrest. And I remember going to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami in 2006. And they're, with fire-breathing press conferences saying how they've arrested these terrorists and they're from, Liberty City. And I remember thinking like, this is, I knew Miami. It was ridiculous, this idea that, these terrorists would be from Liberty City. And I was also struck by, despite the fact that, they were, the U.S. attorney was asked, were these people actually connected to Al-Qaeda and did they have weapons? And the answer was no. The media at the time really covered it credulously as if this was a real kind of terrorist takedown. And so I covered that case at the time and then moved along with my career not covering terrorism and began to see more and more of these cases happening that kind of had the hallmark, or the hallmarks of the Liberty City case, in the sense that like it was an informant-led investigation where the defendants didn't have actual connections to terrorists, didn't have money, in many cases didn't even have money to buy weapons should they have access to buy them. And I began to get interested in like how often these types of cases happen, and no one was really kind of collecting that data at the time. And I saw that as an opening to kind of look at how many cases were happening, and of those cases, how many used informants. And the numbers were really staggering. And what's important now to realize is the Liberty City 7 case. Those were 7 defendants who were caught up in sting operations. Now the number of defendants who've been caught up in sting operations like this is more than 350. A third of all international terrorism prosecutions since 9/11, involve people caught up in stings who in many cases had no capacity for terrorism on their own. And what Dan and Chris were getting at is exactly right. What ended up happening after 9/11 was that, the FBI was largely caught flat-footed in how to handle terrorism investigations. On 9/11, the head of counterterrorism was a guy named Dale Watson, and a few years later, he was deposed in a kind of an employment discrimination case, and he was asked if he knew the difference between Sunni and Shia, and he said no. And the lawyer deposing him asked, well, don't you think it's important as the head of counterterrorism to know the difference between Sunni and Shia? And his response was just this arrogant, like, a bomb case is a bomb case, right? And that was very much, the FBI's mentality at the time. And so, they didn't, for those very reasons, as Dan was describing, there really wasn't this nuance. I think, sure, there were some people in the FBI who probably thought like, hey, these Moore Science Temple guys aren't really Muslim. But there was also people that were kind of just like ignorant of both Islam and Moore Science Temple, and probably were like, okay, well, they're close enough. And in some of these cases, that really was the case. And I think what's important to understand too is, the FBI, these types of sting tactics weren't new to the post 9/11 era. They were really an adaptation of previous tactics. So if you go back in history in like the 80s, when they used these sting tactics in Abscam or against John DeLorean, there was a lot of people throwing up arms at that time saying, this is entrapment. How can we do this? And over time, these tactics ended up being accepted both by the legal system and the courts and by society. And you saw this proliferation of those types of cases in the 80s and 90s during the drug war, where they would, act as buyers or sellers. And then when 9/11 happens, they import that same tactic and use it in these stings. And, when I've talked to FBI agents about this, what they say is like, you're making a big deal about this, but we've been doing this, for decades now, and this hasn't been an issue. And, what I keep coming back on, and I've never really been able to get an FBI agent to defend this, is that, the idea that it's a separate issue of whether stings are proper or whether there's entrapment. But to compare them to drug stings, I mean, my criticism of terrorism stings kind of writ large has always been that, if you're getting involved in a drug sting, if the FBI wasn't there buying and selling drugs, it's reasonable to conclude that there's enough drugs in the United States that if you really wanted to buy or sell drugs, you could find a willing participant who wasn't an FBI operative or agent. But the difference with terrorism cases is that, there's very little, there hasn't been a case where someone like a Narseal Batiste was wanting to get involved in terrorism and an actual Al-Qaeda operative or ISIS operative was like, here, let me help you out with that. And so, the FBI is really making possible a crime that really otherwise wouldn't be possible. And in that way, kind of creating the perception or exaggerating the perception that terrorism from within Muslim communities is far greater than it really is. And, I think what's important about these cases as well is to understand that, in addition to the, personal, the price that the families and the defendants in these cases have paid, there's also been this kind of change in our society. I mean, as Chris was mentioning, in the beginning of the Obama administration, there was that DHS report that said, right-wing terrorism really is a greater threat, the greatest threat we face today. And that was, largely criticized by right-wing media. And at the same time, the FBI continued with these type of counterterrorism sting cases that targeted Muslims or, people that reasonably could be passed off as Muslims to the public. And those stories, made the evening news and they make the front pages of major newspapers. And it creates this perception that, terrorism from within Muslim communities is our greatest threat in the United States. And, you go back to, Donald Trump running for president in 2016. And, one of his most famous speeches was when he says we want to, create this Muslim ban and close down the borders until we figure out what the hell is going on, right? And, Trump didn't invent this idea that, terrorism is coming from Muslim communities and we need to take drastic action by creating a Muslim ban. I mean, he really just tapped into this narrative that the FBI and the Justice Department created through these types of sting operations. And, they continue today. I mean, when I first met Chris, this would have been in 2011. And I really had just, I'd been working on this subject for a couple of years and I never expected to, now 10 years later, still be reporting on this. But what's been incredible is that like these tactics, have been kind of written about and put out there, and really little has changed with how the government operates. And in some ways, we're even seeing an expansion. The DEA now runs what are called narco-terrorism stings, where they go all around the world with undercover agents and, find people who want to, exchange weapons for cocaine from FARC and, pass those weapons on to Al-Qaeda or other groups. And I mean, of course, this is all made up and these cases are kind of put together whole cloth by the DEA. And then, even today you're seeing, that these types of tactics being used against, right-wing extremists. And so I think, we do live in this precarious time right now, I think, where there is this increasing threat from domestic extremists within the United States, as the January 6th, riot clearly showed. But I'm not convinced that the FBI really knows how to investigate extremists and domestic violent extremists outside of the use of these sting tactics. And, what's kind of concerning for me, I think, is that, what these sting tactics have clearly shown is that they're able to find people who are kind of on the margins and are, can be manipulated by informants or undercover agents. But there's really little evidence to show that they're actually finding the people on the verge of committing attacks. Because obviously there have been terrorist attacks in the United States since 9/11, and the FBI wasn't there getting in the way. That where they have been kind of impeding people have been people who like have very little capacity to commit terrorism. And so for me, I think, you know, one of the concerning storylines going forward is like, you know, can the FBI, now that it's been, you know, pursuing cases like this for 20 some years, really go after these cases that may pose serious dangers to the United States?
Because they're so addicted to this one model that where they control the whole narrative, they control everything about it. And I mean, I understand how it came about after 9/11. They were doing everything to prevent another attack, but then they didn't care at all how many people's lives they ruined, how many family members' lives they ruined. They didn't care about completely terrorizing the Muslim community. And I mean, and now it's 20 years later, and you're saying not much has really changed. I mean, what do you think it would take to, I mean, number one, stop doing this to Muslims, but also stop using this model and try to actually investigate crime like they were supposed to do in the first place? I mean, instead of creating the crime, do you see any recognition on the part of the FBI that there's a problem with this model? I guess not. I mean, what is it going to take?
Yeah, I mean, there have been articles written for 10 years. You know, there have been films like Dan's and Chris's. I mean, you know, the criticism is plain and out there for anyone to see. You know, I mean, part of the problem is what Dan was mentioning earlier, this idea that, you know, post 9/11, there was a push to split the FBI into two, kind of an MI5, MI6 structure. And Robert Mueller, who was the FBI director at the time, really pushed the Bush administration not to do that, saying that he felt that a law enforcement component would be helpful in kind of counterterrorism and counterintelligence, that having everything under one agency was beneficial. But, you know, I think what we can say pretty definitively now is one of the bad side effects of that is that you now have what is effectively a counterintelligence agency in the FBI, you know, really kind of measuring its success to Congress and to the public through traditional law enforcement metrics, right? Like the number of arrests made, the number of prosecutions. And, you know, the truth with counterintelligence is most of the important counterintelligence work is the type of work that doesn't result in arrests and doesn't result in, you know, officials going to Congress or Parliament or wherever it might be and saying, hey, we did this. It's really secretive work that keeps the public safe. But the FBI is now tasked with being both a counterintelligence agency and a law enforcement agency, and going to Congress to justify its budget. And so these types of stings offer a really good way for them to say, like, hey, look at the number of arrests we've made and all of these terrorists we've busted. And there is a bit of a kind of wag the dog situation where, you know, Congress allocates the majority of the FBI's budget to counterterrorism. You know, the FBI then every year goes back to justify that budget, and it uses cases like this as examples of how it's foiled terrorism. And, you know, it just creates this cycle where it justifies these inflated budgets. And really what we need, and we haven't, is, you know, far more aggressive congressional oversight. I think, you know, absent, you know, there's been plenty of media coverage on this issue, but there hasn't been much political will to really, you know, bring the FBI to answer a lot of these questions before Congress, in part because I think politically it's difficult for representatives to be seen as, you know, tough on FBI agents who are ostensibly being tough on terrorists, right? You go back to your, you know, district in Kansas or Florida, and your opponent can run TV ads saying, you know, Representative so-and-so is weak on terrorism. And it just, it creates a situation where there hasn't been the level of accountability that I think there really should be. You know, I mean, just as one example, you know, in a lot of these cases, like in Liberty City 7, Ellie or Eli Assad, you know, there are informants who are committing crimes while working with the FBI, and it's like a black box. The FBI doesn't really disclose any of this information unless it's forced to. And there's a representative from Massachusetts who for more than a decade has been putting forward this bill that would basically require the FBI to tell Congress every time one of its informants commits a crime that isn't authorized, which seems like a reasonable oversight, you know, measure. And he can get no traction for that. And so that, to me, that's just like one example of how, you know, this problem is well known, but for whatever reason, there isn't the political will to really address it.
I think you have, you know, the United Kingdom has, if I can just say briefly, the UK for a long time fought a war against the Irish Republican Army and other terrorist groups within in the tragic situation we had in Northern Ireland. And I've never heard, and Chris, you can interrupt me if you have, but I never heard of the British intelligence services running any of these weird, reverse sting operations. I think, the British intelligence relied on infiltration and spy work, and a lot of the stuff that would have been their greatest successes, no one ever heard of and probably never will. And the outcome of good spy work is nobody knows that you've done it, because you can't disclose your assets and you can't disclose what you're doing on your networks. And so, yeah, it doesn't lend itself to that, like, ta-da, we arrested 58 people, we had, we took down 5, and I think it sort of does seem as if the FBI has been just, because it couldn't penetrate real terror networks, it's been creating little fake ones and taking those down. And that's really dangerous, because you do need proper counterterrorism. And when there are real terror groups around.
It's optics, isn't it? I think since 9/11, we've been dominated by false narratives. And I'm not saying that with a tin hat on. I just mean that if you divide the world in two and say either you're with us or against us, you set up immediately a narrative of paranoia about anybody who might be on the side that you're not on. And it's not like that. So you make that division right at the start, you launch a war on terror, and suddenly everything is highly polarized. And within that environment, it's impossible to be reasonable about people who have accidentally become the suspicious group. And then all of it, it's a performance, really. I mean, like you said, Trevor, the FBI need to show that they're protecting the nation from things which, it just so happens, don't really exist. But because there's a regular tick over of arrests and funding for more of the same, well, for most people, that is the reality. So how do you I remember talking to a defense lawyer who said, this is how difficult my game is. On day one of the trial, when we had a terrorist suspect in the dock, we turn up in court and the jury are they're all dressed so that they look like an American flag. And he said, where's that case going to go? So you're dealing with, it's a very difficult thing to do, to unpick a false narrative. If you say to people that there just aren't that many Muslim plots against the United States, most people would just look at you like you were mad. Haven't you seen the news? Haven't you been paying attention? What are you talking about? So it's really, really difficult, which I think, because I've spoken to FBI agents who say, this is ridiculous. They say, we arrested some guys last week, they weren't terrorists, but they can't speak out either. You're not welcome if you cross that line. So it's really difficult. And there's no sort of equivalent, as you say, Trevor, of a sort of Chuck Grassley who will foreground something that is running against the grain. He helps whistleblowers. I think he still does that, doesn't he? But it's a real one-off and a lucky strike if you can break the narrative.
Yeah, and Grassley's a good example of, there is one senator who is providing some measure of oversight. He is pretty aggressive in asking the FBI and DOJ for documents, but he's really the lone senator, right? And so as a result, any body of 100 people is going to require more than just one of them to be, having an effective measure. And so that's been largely the problem with Grassley for sure. And then the other thing, I think is important to mention in the context of these cases is, and kind of the fear that this creates, because the FBI controls every part of the plot, what we see, especially, after the FBI learned its lessons from, the Liberty City 7 case and say the Muhammad Maui case in Ohio, where the plot was kind of nebulous and they never kind of walked them right up to that line. What you see now is the FBI has kind of refined the tactic where, as Chris shows in his film, where they get the person to dial the cell phone to detonate a bomb. But what's important to understand too is that when the public hears about these cases, they're hearing about the Muslim who has a bomb or has surface to air missiles, and it's really the FBI that is obviously introducing that. And so, they're able to kind of dial up the fear, in America, because they aren't just giving these people a handgun or a knife or a machete. They're giving them, a car bomb or a surface to air missile. And that not only kind of creates this perception that this is a really, sophisticated, deadly potential attack, but then it puts the defendant in this very difficult position that, some attorneys refer to as sentencing entrapment, because the introduction of that weapon qualifies them for fairly draconian or rather draconian minimum sentencing guidelines. So in many cases, these defendants are facing 30, 40 years in prison if they take it to trial, in some cases life. And, the Justice Department goes to them and says, okay, take a plea and we'll give you 13 years. And what we're seeing is in a lot of these cases, the defendants are choosing to go that route for obvious reasons. And, so what we know about these cases is even more limited in a sense, because many of these cases that may have very egregious behavior by the FBI never fully get examined because the discovery isn't made available, because there are so many plea deals that happen.
That's a really
and that
good
was one
point.
of the extraordinary things about Liberty City was that these 7 guys decided to go to court. None of them took a plea, and that gave us the opportunity to examine the evidence and examine the whole process that went into these cases. So that was particularly valuable.
Yeah, I always think if these cases as very much kind of like a tip of the iceberg, like the egregious behavior that we know about in the few dozen cases where a lot of the evidence came about through discovery, is probably just a small fraction of the really egregious behavior that we haven't been able to get at, because so many of these defendants, in many cases, these defendants I've talked to in sting cases who have contacted me from prison after reading my book, will tell me, like, I didn't even get to see my discovery. Like, I don't even know what's in it. And so, I've always wondered, what kind of jaw-dropping egregious acts we haven't heard of or been uncovered because of the extraordinary ability for DOJ to get plea deals.
Yeah, and it makes sense for people to plead, given that there's a 99% conviction rate in these cases, because there's no entrapment defense. So if I had one of these defendants, I'd probably try to get them to take a plea deal too, even though I know that I wouldn't get the discovery, and maybe the case would fall apart when you get the discovery, but you're gambling with their life. And so in the Newberg case, they did that mandatory minimum sentence, as you know, where they manufactured the fact that there was this missile involved, and they were this Stinger missile, the same one that they used in our case in Albany with the same informant, and that created the sentencing entrapment of the mandatory minimum 25-year sentence. So they couldn't get any less than that, even though the judge probably wanted to give them less than that. And hopefully now we can go back to that judge on the motions we're doing for them and get them out early on a compassionate release motion. But there's no legal mechanism for many of these cases, especially if the judge wanted to give them the sentence they ended up giving them, because they bought into the fear for whatever reason. And in this Liberty City case, I'm also kind of astounded that they went to trial 3 times and didn't give up. I mean, that's really unusual. The Holy Land case, it was 2 trials. This one, it was 3 trials, and they just kept going at it until they got them all. Well, they didn't get all of them because they lost a few along the way that got acquitted, luckily, but they got most all of them eventually. And I mean, why were they so relentless when they knew that they weren't a threat? I guess just we're running out of time soon, but I wanted to bring up the connection of race and class and Islam into this. I mean, because that plays a huge role in the Newberg case. They were African American, very, very poor, just wanted the money. And the same thing in the Liberty City case. You have people that are targeted basically for being Black and poor, and they weren't even Muslim, but they had to be made to look Muslim, right? What do you think about that? This is for anybody, just that, and then we'll wrap up.
I don't think you can say they were targeted for being Black, because the tip, the FBI didn't go to Liberty City and look for Black people to fit up in a terrorist plot. They definitely, I struggle to imagine that this would have happened to these 7 guys had they been, from a more comfortable white, for instance, background. Their their poverty and their lack of perspective, and the fact that they came from a place that was, you know, that felt so distant from 9/11 and everything that happened, and felt so distant from terrorism, I think that made them very vulnerable. You know, so I think it's true to say that their social predicament made them extremely vulnerable to this type of operation. You know, I think that it's striking how they, just to go back to the last point, how that group stuck together. They all felt that the things they were doing, and, you know, without going to the story of the film, the activities they were carrying out in Liberty City, organized activities, were worthwhile, and they all felt they were good people doing a good thing, and that really gave them, I think, the moral strength not to take a plea and not to kind of rat on each other. And I think it was very hard for a jury to understand why, without getting into the detail of the case, why these young men acted the way they did without being able to. It was very hard for the jury to understand that, because they had never lived the kind of life that these 7 young men had lived in the place where they lived, where they had a completely different perspective to the type of people who were in the jury, and certainly to most of the FBI agents. I think, you know, the FBI agent I interviewed in the film, Anthony Velasquez, was from kind of the wrong side of the tracks in New York, if you like, and he had a much better grasp of who these guys were, but and I think sort of kind of watched in horror as the case built. But yeah, this was a tragedy of different optics. You know, you had a jury that couldn't, and a judiciary that couldn't possibly understand why on earth these guys would have behaved in the way they did. And I think so. You know, I think it's kind of more complex than just race. It's social predicament, and it's a whole mass of different things.
But I would say being black didn't help, because
for sure
you see it in other cases. The case we went up and met the family of an imam who was shot in Detroit, and the suspicion that clustered around that imam that led to an unnecessarily huge intervention by the FBI, which was so one-sided that if any fighting occurred, the suspects were going to be shot. That was the amount of suspicion would not have been to the same scale if he hadn't been black or brown. And I remember talking to Liberty City jurors as well, and they don't understand that. One juror was saying to me, I mean, that he understood Liberty City in terms of the riots which had happened in the 80s, where I think a couple of people had been killed by black people rioting in Liberty City because the place was really unlivable and they were being picked on by the police. And he'd stored that in his head and sort of fed that into his interpretation of who Narseal Batiste and his co-defendants were. And if anybody took, I remember the first time I met Cassie's family, and you know, Gio and Nick, the brothers as well, and it was clearly a functioning family with, you know, strong values, and something that even without meeting Narseal himself, it was possible to tell that it was extremely unlikely that this was going to be the sort of a place where a terrorist plot would hatch. You know, it was just unthinkable. But I think there are boundaries in American society which makes it difficult to imagine the lives of people
exactly
that aren't like you. I mean, that applies to all of us, but it's really a duty to understand why somebody might be marching around or thinking it's a good idea to teach people chess or martial arts and these kind of things, what that means to people. And I think the lads in Dan's film really show that. You know, I remember looking the first at the Rushes when Dan had interviewed them, and it was so clear that what meaning this had given to their lives.
And I remember the one guy in your film, I don't remember which guy it was, that said like he didn't even believe this informant that he was really doing this stuff, because he's like, we're used to seeing people get shot and there's real violence all around us, and this guy's just talking, it's not for real. And there was that understanding, which the director really had no idea.
I think the behavior that was being observed and surveilled by the FBI. So the FBI is kind of looking through a keyhole, right, at these guys' lives, and they're looking at a tiny percentage of what these guys were doing with their lives. So most of the time they were on a construction site, they were doing this, they were doing that, and to the Liberty City 7, this crazy scam of like trying to con this Arab guy into parting with $50,000 by kind of vaguely posing as terrorists. That was just a tiny little part of what they were doing. Right. But for the FBI, it was everything, and it became magnified into this vast kind of meaningful thing. And I think that's the sort of absurdity of this, and that made it even harder for a jury to understand. But I think we have to go back to the kind of institutional perspective, which is this is not real counterterrorism work. This is not real counterterrorism work. And real counterterrorism work needs to happen. And so I think the big question for law enforcement is, how do you change institutionally? Because clearly some kind of major institutional change is called for here. And to whom do you give the job of how do you reorganize counterterrorism in 20 years after 9/11? It seems to me that work hasn't been done.
Well, stopping doing these sting operations would be a good start, I think. But Narcassia, you wanted to say something before?
Yes, just to add on to what Chris and Dan and everyone has really been saying is, when the situation transpired, I mean, no, there wasn't a big, as it is now with the whole George Floyd, situation that occurred on the racism of blacks. But I mean, in the history, we cannot ignore the facts, right? So had it been a severity of where the FBI agents believed that my father and the other men were actual terrorists, why weren't they shot dead on sight? You see what I mean? So, when they pulled out of the temple in Liberty City boxes of bubble gum, why didn't anyone indicate to them, like, are you guys really going to go, forth with this? But see, the hindsight of what was portrayed was, oh no, those are boxes of massive bombs and guns. It was bubble gum. Because a part of the actual temple was going to be a daycare for children. Okay. We were bringing people off of the street who were hungry, who were homeless, who didn't have a job, who were prostitutes, who were selling dope in the streets. And my father saw a better vision for these men to bring them up to be leaders in the community and law-abiding citizens of the community. And I work with the young women and sisters with my mother, cooking meals and learning how to have the etiquette of a woman. Okay. And, it's just what is portrayed, the illusion that was meant for, the federal government and what their goals and their narrative that they wanted to spin off. They really did a real good job of trying to coerce these young men and individuals, my father, into what it was that they wanted to streamline, as opposed to what the actual insights of what the true intentions were. And it's very sad to know that people don't care about other families that have experienced the same kind of trauma and the lifelong results of those situations, because mental health is very important. And thankfully, now more people are coming out, more people within the Lime stream are coming out and speaking on mental illness, speaking on drug problems. Those we could have all fell under that system of, Narcassia is a drug addict, Giovanni is a coke, like all kind of different things. But that's not the upbringing that we've had. And because, as you mentioned, Chris, meeting us initially, you can already see the principles and morals that were instilled within us from my mother and my father. And we are a product of who they truly are. And we hold to their standards. We hold to that stature. And we will continue to uplift and bring, God's children together, and let us just continue to live in peace and happiness and humility. And that's all.
Yeah, thank you, Narcassia, and I hope that you can come to our family conference when we have it in person and meet some of the other families who've been through this. And I think you can be an inspiration to them.
I would love
having
to.
such a positive attitude after everything you've been through.
Thank you.
And can we have some closing remarks from everybody, or whoever feels like giving any closing remarks briefly?
Trevor, I think you should have the closing remarks.
I would just say, and this is relevance to, January 6th as well. Like, there are some, I agree with Dan on the issue of the question of is there a racial disparity? And while it is true that in many of these cases, the majority of these defendants are Black or brown, but there are a number of white converts to Islam who've been targeted, and they've received, punishments as harsh as the others. And so I don't view it so much as a racial issue, but I definitely think there's a double standard in the United States when it comes to terrorism, as far as like as it sees, Islamic or Islamist terrorism versus domestic extremism. And that's not just in how, the FBI investigates them, although that's a big part of it, but it's also in the decisions that the Justice Department makes in charging crimes. As an example, a Muslim who puts a bomb in a trash can, ostensibly for ISIS, gets charged with using a weapon of mass destruction. In recent history, a violent domestic extremist who bombs an abortion clinic does not get charged with using a weapon of mass destruction. It gets charged with a firearms violation or an explosive violation, which not only, provides a much more lenient sentence if convicted, but also doesn't trigger the kind of media attention that a terrorism case gets, right? And so you look, for example, at the insurrection or the Capitol riot, whatever you want to term it, and many of these defendants are being charged with misdemeanors or being charged with felonies that do not carry very stiff punishments, even though you could argue that there are statutes they could be charged under, including material support, that provide much more aggressive sentencing. And I'm not arguing for the Justice Department to charge everyone more aggressively, but I do think it's worth noting that there is this substantial double standard that I think these types of the decisions that the Justice Department makes as far as like who's a terrorist and who qualifies for these very draconian charges, percolate throughout society to the point that that's how we begin to define who is a terrorist and who is not a terrorist. And it allows, I think, the domestic extremists to really make this case that they're not getting involved in acts of terrorism, even though when you look at some of the acts of violence we've seen, I think you can fairly classify it as such if you classify similar acts of violence involving Islamists that way. And so I think there is this huge institutional issue, but it is one that ultimately, because of the power of the FBI and the Justice Department, it really begins to change our terms, right? Like what we refer to as a terrorist and who is a terrorist. And, as Chris was saying, we do live in this time of false narratives where it's either with us or against us. And, the term terrorist is really, historically has been such a, politically malleable term. And yet I think, the Justice Department, through its decisions and its charging decisions, even when it's not a sting, even when an actual crime has occurred, they are choosing to go fairly lenient on, domestic extremists who are largely white, while going very aggressively against, Muslim, alleged terrorists who are black or brown in large proportion.
And you have to look at Islamophobia as you're saying, it's Muslims that are being targeted, and if they're Black Muslims, they probably get treated even more harshly. And so I think that is a big part of this. And when somebody's targeted for being Muslim, it's sort of like racialization. It's sort of like race, even though it's not exactly race. So it's a matter of, you know, discrimination based on your religion or your race. And I agree that we shouldn't be going more harshly against white non-Muslims, but that we should be going less harshly against Muslims and people of color. And that I hope that this sort of racial reckoning that's going on leads to some more justice in these kinds of cases too. And thanks to everyone for being with us. It's been an interesting discussion, and thanks for your movies, and thank you, Narcassia. So, and we'll sign off with that.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a blessed day.
Bye.